Get ready to profit in 3, 2, 1.
Hey squad, Ben Page here, joined by Blake John today.
Hey team.
Just part of the 2100 digital team in a special SEO focused episode for you. And today we're going to cover SEO website migration tips. We're going to share some of the good, the bad, and the ugly that we've seen, considerations and advice on how to make yours go more smoothly, whether you're in the midst of one now or considering one in the future. So Blake, let's start out by setting the table and discussing what is a website migration, because I feel like it's a term that gets applied to a lot of different situations with many potential outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of is a broad term, and people use it just generally speaking as like big changes, overhauls to a website. But I think specifically in the way that we're going to talk about it, there's kind of like 4 main website migrations, and specifically that's a hosting change, which is sort of a smaller one, but still I think one that people gloss over, and it is kind of a site migration. A domain name change, which is a really, really big site migration. There's a CMS change, which can kind of be complicated, hairy. And then lastly, I think this is the most common type of site migration. It's like a redesign when you want to just kind of change the front end. Maybe you're sort of updating your brand, your look and feel. That's kind of the most common site migration that we come across in all cases. All of these, lots of things can go wrong, and you've got to make sure you've got someone on your end to help you out and make sure you get things right.
Yeah, I feel that redesign is probably the most commonly used term, by people, but it can also contain all of the aforementioned elements as well. It can contain a CMS, also known as a content management system,
right?
Change or a replatforming. It can also contain hosting and DNS changes. I believe for this episode, we'll focus most of our energy on this website redesign, and SEO implications. But do we want to quickly touch on some of the potential impacts of things like a hosting or DNS change as well, or even CMS change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when you undergo a redesign or like any one of these, site migration types, I suppose, a lot of things can change. And generally speaking, again, we'll kind of focus mostly on like the redesign when you bring in a designer or developer to kind of give your site a facelift. Again, that's the most common type of site redesign. A lot of things kind of get changed without a lot of thought or consideration or planning, which can kind of derail organic performance down the road after you launch the new site. And specifically, these are things like the structure and most specifically the URLs of your website. Obviously, the design will be changing a lot. That can have an impact just on user experience and things of that nature. But then also the content too, and especially when you, if you're ranking well and you're driving a lot of traffic, like you don't want to lose content that's been performing well. And sometimes things that shouldn't get tossed aside just get completely neglected as a result of these redesigns. And of course, a part of that too is metadata and things of that nature, and losing title tags that have been working, as an example, or H1 tags that were really well like detailed and optimized. And some other things, like one last thing we have in our notes here that I think is easy to forget, structured data, losing structured data, which is a key component of your organic presence and presenting yourself online that oftentimes gets overlooked.
Yeah, many things to consider. And if you're working through a redesign, and that includes things like changing CMS, let's say you have right now a static HTML website and you're moving it to WordPress, or any combination of those, or a hosting change. Maybe you're hosted on GoDaddy today, or Wix, right? And you're going to move to Pantheon or Kinsta. The change in that hosting environment and the server properties might affect things like site speed and availability. That's one interesting thing. The CMS might affect things like default title tags and descriptions and schema, and just how different HTML elements are coded by default on the website, all of which can impact your SEO results, your visibility in the SERPs, the crawlability of your website, and the ability for search engines to index it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and we'll probably, we'll talk more about each one of these things a little bit, as we kind of continue. But one thing that's just so important through all of this, and I think it's probably one of the main takeaways, is when you're going through a redesign and when you you kind of set foot and this is what you're going for, the sooner you can get somebody in who can kind of be responsible for these things and take accountability. And specifically in my mind, I'm thinking like an SEO, someone who has experience helping sites through the migration process, the better, because they're going to take all these things into consideration. You're going to have somebody who is sort of either working from a checklist or creating that checklist based on your specific use case. And they're going to hold everyone accountable to make sure that these things don't get lost in translation. Because, and we've talked about this too, like I kind of liken it to a deck of cards, and like once you reshuffle that deck of cards, you're never going to get the same order again. Everything's going to change. And so you've got to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row, your I's dotted, your T's crossed before that launch day, because things can go awry if they're not.
Yeah, and for a site of any significant size, even 6 URLs, all the way up to thousands of URLs, multi-category structure, let's clearly state that it's not enough from an SEO perspective to simply check some of the default settings within your content management system or plugins and then go live and expect things to go well. Because like you said, there are a lot of considerations in the planning phase and setup phase that are sort of breakpoints or branching points, leading up to, is this going to go well or not? I mean, what are other things that commonly happen that cause SEO problems when there isn't someone advocating from that perspective during that process? Any other major pitfalls you've seen, Blake?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, truthfully. And what's funny is in a site migration, so many things change. But like as the SEO and as the guy who wants to make sure, organic search can still succeed and perform well beyond the launch day, really what I'm trying to do is keep as many things the same from the legacy site to the new site. And the biggest one, and this is like the biggest thing that can kind of go wrong, are URLs. And specifically your URL structure. We had an example recently where a site launched without the www. The legacy site was www.example.com, and then it launched with just example.com. They dropped the www. And from a developer's perspective, they're like, oh, it's maybe it's easier to manage. The forwarding HTTPS is easier, whatever it might be. It's easier just typing your URL. You don't have to worry about that redirect because no one's actually typing www anymore these days. But from an organic perspective and from like a site structure perspective, we're literally talking about a brand new website, a completely brand new website, and all of that link equity, all of that authority that was previously associated with the www.domain.com site, now it's literally moved to a new place.
Right.
Google has to figure that out, and of course, the other thing too we'll talk about in a part of this is redirects. Google has to figure that out, and usually the best way through that is really the only true way is through redirects. But if you can reduce those redirects and you can try to keep as many things as the same, you're more likely to have success sooner post-launch.
Right, because there are fewer steps and crawls, if you want to think of it that way, that need to happen, and kind of reshuffling of the deck, in order to regain your visibility. I mean, do you have any, in that example, Blake, where they dropped www, what happened? What was the actual impact in the coming days after?
Yeah, so for this specific example, so I've actually seen that specific example, I've seen more than once.
Yes.
One time I came to the site and performance was down, year over year, performance was down 40%, 50% or whatever. And this was a new site, new client to me. So I wasn't a part of the migration process. I'm like, what's going on? Like, this is out of control. And then you kind of take a look back and you go through the performance and the data and you figure out what's going on. And you go, interestingly enough, 18 months ago, the site was www.domain.com and now it's not. Like, now I kind of have an idea of what's going on. And along that process, there's probably a mishandling of the redirects and whatnot as well. But in the most recent example, the one that I was thinking about, we caught it 3 days after the launch went. So this is kind of a unique one. The launch was pushed back 6 weeks, which is very common in site redesigns, that launch gets delayed.
Usually content.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's be real.
Truthfully, yeah. It's usually a bandwidth problem with getting all the content either on the site or just even written. So launch was delayed, and then it was kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to say it was a surprise, but it was like launch was kind of pushed up because of the client wanted to get it live. And so it was launched on a Friday, which I don't recommend. And we didn't catch this error until Monday. So it was basically a three day period in which the site was no longer on www, and it had the legacy site was on www. So we caught it on the Monday, and we reverted it basically right away. But what happened in that weekend time, they stopped ranking for their brand.
Oh no!
Which is like the worst case scenario. They weren't ranking for it. Like,
if you can't even rank for your brand,
right? And
you're done.
That's kind of, I mean, that's like a microcosm of all, like the kind of impact that these site migrations can have, truthfully. And so we fixed that, and within the next 24 hours, though, they were back ranking for their brand after we fixed it. We put on and I think that would have happened over time, but it would have been slower,
right?
Because again, like. And I know people don't think about this in this way because www is just sort of, it's I don't know, taken for granted is not the right word. It's just not
almost legacy at this point.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's almost like
rarely
trivial.
Yeah,
but it's literally www is technically by definition a subdomain. And then when you strip that out, now you're on it's technically now you're on a different subdomain. You're without a subdomain essentially.
Right.
And so again, it's literally a second site. It's a completely different site now without the www.
So let's this URL change thing, like it's, again, sort of a broad label. Let's talk about the different classes of URL changes, because you've got things like, we updated a few category names or something like that. So like maybe there's folder structure. So I guess there's individual URLs changing, which, okay. Then you've got like folder structure changes. Then you've got what you just mentioned, like www or subdomain changes. Yeah. And then you've got, this is like the Voldemort of URL changes. If you change your root domain name, and how you manage that. But I suppose, any other thoughts on this? I mean they have different levels of
thoughts.
Yeah.
Truthfully, like I have so many thoughts about this. So if you're I'll start with this. If you're changing your domain name, so if you're going from domain.com to example.com, as an example, right? That's really tricky. And truthfully, I would like, as a SEO, I would tell you you're going to see a loss in organic traffic because it's a completely different domain. And like we just kind of mentioned, Google has to relearn that, map all the link equity and
right. And if that new domain hasn't been registered historically or has no equity or domain authority of its own, right, that's going to be a very tricky site migration scenario. Exactly.
So that's one, and we'll just cover that kind of broadly, just by saying that's a tough one because everything is changing, and you can't limit the changes because it's literally a new domain.
And this could happen. I'm just thinking about real life situations, like maybe there's a merger acquisition, something like that, right? And then eventually, we're going to fold acquired domain into our domain, so, something like that, and we need to have a redirect strategy. We need to fold content, But that's one real life case where it could happen.
Yeah, and I guess as like a tip or a best practice, so first and foremost, in all of these redesign, you need to have a really strong redirect strategy, like you just mentioned, Ben. And it needs to be one-to-one, like as one-to-one as humanly possible. And if you are changing domain names, I recommend trying to keep the content on the legacy site as close to the same as possible on the new site, just because there's less for Google to learn, like less to become familiar with, essentially. You know what I mean? And because all the URLs, the domain, it's all changing, at least kind of keep as much of the content as the same as possible. So there's just less for Google to sort of figure out and like make sense of.
Can we tell listeners or define terms on redirect, like in very basic practical terms, or, more technically if you'd like? What is a redirect, Blake? Why should an executive listening to this care about what that is?
Yeah, so it's literally a direction to a browser or like
search engine,
like a crawler, I guess. Yeah, to pointing from one like address to another address. And the most commonly in what you should be using in redesigns is a 301, which is a permanent redirect. There's other versions like a 302, which is a temporary redirect. And in a redesign, you probably shouldn't use a 302. There's also like a 307, but 301s and 302s are the most common.
Right. So it's almost like old school like mail forwarding, like post office style, right? And then
exactly.
And then to your point, there's different like number codes that are basically sets of instructions about how to treat that specific forwarding request, if you want to think of it.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's just like forwarding your mail to a new location.
And it's like, how do you want to forward it? Do you want to forward all the things to one place? Do you want to forward each one to a new individual mailbox at the new location? Or, is this just for 2 weeks? You're on vacation? Is it forever? You moved, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why you would use a temporary, say your site was just kind of undergoing like a
seasonal change
or
some updates. Yeah.
It's under construction. I think a lot of people sometimes have seen that like on actual websites, they'll have a message saying under construction. And so like for temporarily, they'll point you to this other place, but eventually, and I would say usually within like 4 to 6 weeks, I would try to keep the temporary redirect. You come back to that page and you have your content is back or whatever, like the designs may be updated, whatever it might be. But I want to talk about like these other URL changes. So you're talking about folder structure changes.
Right.
You talked about just like URL, like just
individual path
like the page changes.
Right.
Again, like if possible, you're going through this redesign process, I would recommend trying to keep them as not even as similar, but trying to keep them the same if you can. If you can keep them the same, that would be truly preferred.
And avoid, here's like an action tip, right? It's like avoid global changes wherever possible. We talked about 2 examples. If you literally change your domain name or you change a subdomain, those are global changes. Avoid things that are going to affect every single URL on the site.
Yes, absolutely. And a third one that is commonly overlooked, but like the backslash. So generally speaking,
the dagger.
Most websites have a trailing slash at the end of all the URLs. Some websites don't. And so when you migrate, if there's no backslash, and you kept the URL the same, like now technically that is a redirect because Google has to
it used to live at da-da-da-da.
Yeah, now it lives at da-da-da slash.
Slash, yeah. No.
Right, exactly. So that's one. But the one thing that I'll say too is if it I'm recommending trying to keep the URLs the same because it'll reduce the change. It'll increase the likelihood of just performing like status quo after the redesign. There are a lot of use cases in which URL changes are warranted and like worthwhile. So for an example, some sites are on a flat URL structure, which means there are no folders. Every page is, from a URL perspective,
off the root domain.
Right off the root domain. In that situation, it's like, well, this is really for the better. It's a better organization of content. It makes more sense to users. It makes more sense to crawlers. It's easier to report on now from a performance measurement perspective. Like if you have 200 blogs, 500, 1,000 blogs, whatever it is, it's a flat URL structure. Like, yes, I think that you should probably add /blog/ the title of blog
XYZ.
now. Yeah, exactly. But in other cases, like if it's not absolutely like mandatory required, there's not a significant boost from changing the URL, just don't. Like there's no reason for it in most cases. Like I look at some of these and I'm like, why did we do that?
Well,
and
no one wanted it to say plural in the URL instead of singular or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, but for what did you gain from that? There's nothing to really gain. And it kind of hurts me inside. I'm like, it's just
needless.
It's just cosmetic, but it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't. I always would recommend keeping it the same if possible.
Well, and an inverse case might be, I've seen this happen where, like a valid change of folder structure or URL change, if you want to think of it that way, is like consolidating a mega menu to a simpler navigation, main navigation. That too, where, you had gnarly subfolders that were, again, like needless, very thin content in these arcane 3 folders deep structures and stuff. And it's like, well, let's make this a little bit easier to digest for users. And that could be another.
Absolutely. And again, there are situations where updating the folder structure, changing the URLs, it makes sense. But the key here is to like really think about it, kind of vet your thinking, either with a third party or like a professional SEO or whatever, and just make sure, like, okay, is it worth it? Is this going to drastically improve either user experience or general content organization? And if you don't feel like that's the case, then I wouldn't recommend changing the URLs.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we hammered on kind of URLs, structure. We talked a little bit about metadata. So like page title, or AKA a simple way to think of this is the browser tab name. And keeping things fairly similar. Structured data. I mean, do we want to touch on structured data and like content specific changes?
Yeah, I think we probably should. So content, this is a tough one because I think and this is oftentimes, again, it gets overlooked, but on the legacy, you should really do a content audit on the legacy site. And we've talked about this on other episodes too, like keep, kill, combine. You have to figure out what you're going to keep, what you're going to get rid of, and what you're going to consolidate.
Right.
And you want to take a look at this from like a performance perspective too, and say, okay, our pieces of content, like your money pages, they should probably stay pretty similar. Like that's what I would recommend.
No wholesale changes for the sake of change.
Exactly. And a redesign is a good time to like trim the fat too. There might be content on your website that just, it's not really adding value anywhere. It's not driving traffic. You're not getting leads or business or whatever from this. It's like, okay, maybe we can consolidate this or just cut it out entirely. Like those things happen. But again, you kind of have to go through that process, be really cognizant of it, and make sure that you're not cutting out things that you shouldn't, like things that are driving business, like be obviously really careful of that. And then in terms of structured data, it again kind of falls on the line of like content audit. But if there is schema markup on specific pages, carrying that forward. We had an example where for an addiction treatment client where the schema was just generally local. On the legacy side, it was medical organization.
Practice
I think it's medical organization.
That sounds right, yeah.
And when they launched, they did a redesign. They launched with just general local business, which
seems like it would be a small change.
Yeah, similar, but not quite the same. And obviously medical organization is much more specific and much more relevant to an addiction treatment center. And so we caught that pretty early, actually. We were able to revert that and get that back live on the site. But those things, like especially schema, is easy to overlook because no one's really looking at that on a day-to-day basis. But if you have an SEO on your side, which again I recommend, they can kind of be accountable for that and make sure that the right things are being pulled forward.
Right, which can influence both the kinds of search results you will appear in, and it can impact the way that you're visible in those search results with rich results and other SERP features and so on. So really important. Any other of these kind of common SEO problems to bring to the surface?
I guess the last thing that I would say is, and this kind of goes again, going back to redirects. Don't really redirect anything to your homepage, as crazy as that might sound. I don't remember when I read this or even who stated it, but someone at Google said, like, they treat redirects to the homepage almost as if they were 404s. Like it's like
interesting.
It's like a dead end.
Because it's like a lame choice of page, like, basically, as a redirect.
Exactly. No, there's really, and if you think about it too, in most cases on most websites, there's no page like your homepage. Your homepage is like really, truly very unique. So no other page can really replicate that, and like you probably shouldn't be redirecting it to very often. There might be some, really like off the cuff like use cases where it is possible, but I would say very, very rarely. you should be redirecting to a page that is basically serving the same intent, delivering similar content, and you want to do it one-to-one. So like what that means is you don't want to skip, like redirect to another page that's redirecting to that page. You want to redirect from one source page to
one
the
final
page.
destination. Yeah, no skips, no multi-redirects. That
You
can
want to
slow
avoid the
things
change.
down too.
Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, and I'll give one nod to design because
Sure.
it happens all the time. And let's paint a hypothetical scenario where, let's say all of the SEO considerations have been addressed, and like, let's say the site maintains the same performance from an SEO perspective after launch. Well, redesign from a visual and user experience standpoint, the page templates, look and feel, color, font, all these things, they could positively or negatively impact organic conversion rate on the site. Mm-hmm. And so that's almost a different stream to look at. You want to look at, visibility, engagement, traffic, and also conversion, and perhaps even, post conversion, what happens to that lead. In this case, we're using that example, but, for e-commerce, like if you're redesigning your cart experience or a booking engine, any of those types of changes too, you want to be really thoughtful, I think, about, are the steps to the final destination changing? But just want to give a nod there. It's like, all things being equal, design will greatly impact conversion rates in many cases too.
Yeah. And I mean, in every redesign, you're going to have someone who's like accountable for redesign or for design. Like you're going to have like a designer,
yeah, or a front end dev or something. Yeah.
But not in every redesign you're going to have an SEO, which is, I think you should. I think there should always be. But what I'm trying to say is, I think those two people should like have a conversation, and talk about some of those things. And maybe there's like a UX person who is just responsible specifically for UX. Maybe there's there's a few roles, and they should probably communicate to make sure like you're talking about it doesn't go unaddressed or just neglected. Then you launch and you realize a month later, like, oh, in the checkout process or in the form, like there's this huge roadblock that is preventing people from doing XYZ. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's those little things, especially if multiple of them stack up, that can really sink you.
Yeah.
And let's talk about like, how bad can this get, man? Like, what have you seen? If you don't address these things and you redesign and launch, what's the potential impact?
It bums me out a lot, but it can be pretty bad, man. I've seen situations where traffic and revenue is down 50%. And usually that doesn't happen like immediately. It'll be like, 3 months later.
It's a slow
it's
decline.
Like, over the grand scheme of things, it's not it's not slow, but like sometimes you don't fully realize what's happening until it's almost too late. Which is seriously, it bums me out. But yeah, I've seen situations where traffic and revenue goes down 50% because previous design web dev agencies didn't handle the redirect strategy correctly or whatever it might be, and just organic traffic just drops. Like you just fall off the SERP for like really high value search terms. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've, in my experience, it's not uncommon to see 25 to 50% organic traffic loss, year over year.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's short lived. Your site's getting crawled. If some of these things are in place, it can even be less than that, and it'll be temporary, but sometimes it's permanent. And I think almost the worst thing is, like you said, when it's a slow and steady decay that you're losing 10% per month over month for a year. And then and finally someone's like ringing the alarm bells, like, hey, our revenue's down. Well, why? Well, I don't know. We're humming on paid and affiliates and email and this and that and social, organic. Why? What happened? And then you're like, when you zoom out and you look at the data and you're like, oh no, it's been maybe the slope isn't extreme, but like it's been down and to the right since we launched the redesign. And there's like one case of a current client where they redesigned and we were brought in something like 9 months or so, 6 to 9 months after think it was like 9 months after the redesigned site launched, and they were down at that point 30 to 50%, somewhere in that range, like 30, 40% organic traffic year over year was being lost. And subsequently, it took 12, you could even argue like up to 18 months after that point to start getting back to parity, which was, in this case, it was a combination of building out net new content that started to rank and addressing some of the technical issues, some of the redirect challenges, and re-optimizing, pages that had been pared down in the last redesign. So it can be like really significant. It can tank your results, especially if organic is a huge percentage of your digital traffic and sales or leads.
Yeah, and for that specific example too, because 6 to 9 months after redesign is honestly a very long time. And we went back and we, through some like digging through Google Analytics and Google Search Console specifically, we found a bunch of old URLs that had not been redirected. But 6 to 9, I don't remember exactly how far out we were removed from the redesign.
At that point,
I think it was probably
getting closer to 12 or at
least. And so like we put in the redirects that we literally 1-to-1, we mapped them all out, which is a very tedious process, like doing that, honestly, but it needs to be done. It's so important. So we went through that process of it as if, it was going to launch tomorrow. But at that point, it's so late down the road. Honestly, I don't even know the effects of that. If Google even has access to those old URLs, like, are they crawling them very often? Like, truthfully, it's really hard to say if that's going to have a big impact, but it's sort of like the right thing to do. And it should have been done in the first place. So you kind of have to cover your bases and do it anyways.
Right. It's like it should have been done pre-launch.
Exactly.
But now we're coming in and it's part of the cleanup strategy.
Exactly.
If you think of it that way. So how do you start to hedge against disaster or protect against these worst case scenarios? We talked about, the kinds of site migrations, what can go wrong, how bad it can get. What can people do to not have that happen?
Yeah. So, and I've said this before, I'll just say it again, I think you should have an SEO on your team who's thinking about these things and is responsible for these things. Like, that's sort of numero uno in my mind. One other thing that's just incredibly important, and I think this should be done in every redesign as well, is sort of benchmarking the legacy site. Crawl it with, I recommend using Screaming Frog. There are some other tools like Sitebulb. Crawl it and save it so that after the redesign, you have something to kind of go back to in like a full sitemap that you could lean on to understand where things were previously. Because once again, once you reshuffle that deck of cards, like, you don't know what order that stuff was in. Like, it's just in the past, and you no one has it memorized, right? But if you have a saved file, maybe you have another like specific sitemap file just to understand the structure and how things were really laid out. You're just going to want to do that because, again, like, if there is an issue, you can kind of start to piece some of those things together, because it's really difficult. In this example that we were just talking about, where we came to the situation like 9 months later, we don't have anything to lean on. We don't know what it was like a year ago.
We're pouring through like archive.org,
exactly,
cached versions of the site, trying to, guys, there's, these core paragraphs of content that were stripped away and the URL changed and this, and it's like, no.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, benchmark your old site back, like archive. Honestly, I've used archive.org in some situations. So, like, because you can request them to hit a specific page. That's a great tool too, because it'll take literally a screenshot. And I would say that too, take screenshots of like big money pages or something. Like, you want to have an archive to go back to if you ever need it. It's extremely valuable.
Not only structure, but I'd say also performance, right? Like rankings for head terms, like AKA your most important non-brand and branded keywords, performance on like key pages, organic conversion rates on key pages. So you have both, I guess what we're really saying is a qualitative and quantitative snapshot of how you're doing from an SEO perspective in the period leading up to the redesign, and also like archiving snapshot, documenting what's currently there so that if post-launch you see a continued decline, you can do some of that comparative analysis to draw from the things that were working previously and bring some of that back to hopefully mitigate that or get back on track.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say too, and we kind of briefly touched on this, but it's really common to see a decline after, like a performance decline after a site redesign. But it shouldn't, like realistically, it shouldn't last longer than 6 to 8 weeks.
I was going to say weeks time frame. Yeah.
Yeah. If like, as long as you've done all the things that we're talking about, you've done those things correctly. Like 6 to 8, if it's going beyond 6 to 8 weeks, there's probably an issue. And we need to figure out what's going on, but like it is common to see a decline. And I will say too, it's possible to not see a decline at all. Like if you do all these things correctly, you're really careful, really, really strategic. You could launch and like nothing ever, you could even see a boost, I think.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it's definitely possible.
Yeah, totally. And sometimes the design updates, the improvement to conversion rate will eclipse any minimal SEO visibility change. Like, oh, I lost 5% of organic traffic. Oh, but conversion rate's like double or something.
Right,
like, okay, I'll take the conversion rate, please.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. But hopefully it's clear by this point too. Bring in an SEO earlier in the process, right? We're not saying what we're not saying is during your redesign or your migration process, run a checklist, you're okay. We're saying because all of these things like structure and content and, even UX are all wrapped up in how well you perform organically. Hopefully you have an SEO perspective seat at the table early in the process when you're thinking about planning, because imagine this, right? You benchmark your current site. You can see the strengths, the weaknesses. And for areas where you're performing well, if there are proposed changes or wholesale changes to structure, URLs, content, it's like, is this an essential change before you commit to it? Does this have to be done? Why? Because it's like a risk mitigation thing. What's the upside of this change? What's the potential cost if it goes off the rails? Yep. So bring in the SEO earlier.
And one thing too that I'll talk about, I think is really important is kind of doing like audits throughout the process.
Yes.
Like, I don't know, they're technical audits, I suppose. It's kind of part of the benchmarking process, but like audit the staging site, the staging environment, just to make sure there are no huge significant issues that like when we launched, like we could have like massive sites or massive 404s or something like that, or whatever it might be, or maybe, all the canonical tags are linking to the non-secure version of these pages. Like, why is that happening? You know what I mean? Like, we should probably fix that. And I would recommend to, if there's any SEOs listening, do that throughout the process, because what happens is you'll want to do it like right before it launches, but then sometimes it's just too late.
Like, we've seen that.
Yeah, devs are like, well, we don't have time. Like
time or budget's gone. We're already 20% over. Yeah. Sorry, SEO, we're not going to make
against the wall.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we're launching, and it's like, oh no. Like that's personally happened to me. So the sooner you can highlight an issue, which sometimes it's tough because sometimes you don't even have all that you need until a week before launch to really do a true audit. It can be really challenging, but the sooner the better, obviously, because then you can make a case and you can say, well, we have 30 days before launch, like this needs to be prioritized, and someone will fit it in. You can make it actioned.
Right. And on the staging site, running that tech audit or that, SEO audit, if you want to think of it that way, it's like post most of the content being added and maybe like the official pre-launch QA process. Somewhere in that zone is a great time to run like a tech audit, and then like post-launch, you want to run another sort of audit. And we already talked about the benchmarking. So this is part of what we do when we ride along for site migrations. So pre and post checkup, and then ongoing monitoring. I mean, sounds simple, like very basic, but like paying attention to site health and, via tools, via Search Console, even just basic analytics especially in the days and weeks following. Because like we sort of alluded to earlier, more than a handful of cases I can think of where it's like the awareness of the problem wasn't even there for weeks or months after it's already happening, and sometimes not totally too late, but the damage gets worse over time. It's like compounding pain that can be avoided by monitoring early and often.
Exactly. And this is all just, we talked about it, but having an SEO who has a seat at the table, who can be accountable for these things, like it's just absolutely vital to the process.
Yeah, and so let's talk really briefly about how we plug into site migrations as that SEO voice. Both, I don't know, I think of it as three things that we do, and we work, well, first let's talk about like, who do we work with? We'll work with in-house teams, sometimes even agencies, and we'll work with people, marketing leaders certainly, but then website developers and the more technical folks. We can work with the more front-end design folks, and we can also work with the content team, marketing coordinators, because of how we're plugging into the different components of the SEO strategy. But like as far as the actions that we take, or like the roles that we play is probably a better way to think of it. How does that work, Blake? How do we help throughout this process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, like, in my personal experience, at least in the way that we sort of operate, it's like we're kind of the guide, and I feel, and a lot of times I feel like we're the ones looking out for the business, and trying to make sure that these critical things don't fall through the gaps, because it's going to hurt the business down the road. And I think a lot of times people get wrapped up in like what they're doing so much, they don't think larger picture. So I like to think of myself in these situations, and again, the way that we operate, as like it's kind of a voice of reason to like pull, like, just let's think about this a little bit before we move forward. Because, I know we want to have a nice, newly like polished, redesigned website, but at the end of the day, like we have to drive traffic to this thing or it's not going to matter.
Right.
You know what I mean? And we also will take, the things that we do, we'll handle the redirect strategy, and we'll make sure the technical audits are completed. We can hold other people accountable for making sure they're doing these technical things the right way.
Right. Code changes, content updates,
Yeah.
structural changes.
And truthfully, like some of those things, like it kind of depends on the business, their operating system, I suppose, like what seats they have filled, but we can fill multiple seats. Like we could help manage the content if, like, in doing that audit, if that's what needs to be done. If you don't have a content team, we can kind of fill that role as well. So there's like a hybrid approach, but I think at the end of the day, it's like that voice of reason, that guide, to kind of navigate this really murky, really challenging site redesign to make sure it goes smoothly.
Yeah. So research, analysis, planning, that ongoing consulting piece, and the tech auditing. And like you said, yeah, the guide. I love that analogy. That's awesome. Well, if you're listening and you're considering a redesign, maybe you're in the midst of one, maybe you recently had one and you're experiencing pain, contact us today. You can reach us at 2100digital.com, 2100digital.com. Get the support you need. We're happy to always have a conversation, learn more about your situation. Every site migration is a little bit different based on all these different variables we've covered. And ultimately, hopefully this has been helpful for you to think through some of the considerations, and also to bring that guide along with you on this journey, which is an insurance policy, but it'll set you up for long-term success. And that's what we're really all about here. So thanks for listening, squad.